Okay. Thank you for all coming, and just to let you know that this session will be recorded. I'm going to start with a karakia and introduce our speakers for today, and then I will be handing the reins over to both of them, who will take you through the next probably 45 minutes or so, talking about open access in Aotearoa and updating everybody on the CONZUL study, before returning to me for the closing karakia. So, whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga. Ke mākina kine te uta, ke mātaratara ki tai. Ehi aka ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, pihe Māori ora. So, welcome to Richard White and Jess Howie to come and talk to us today about 5 years of publishing trends in New Zealand research. For 5 years now, the Council of New Zealand University Librarians have been examining the state of open access in Aotearoa, looking at how much of our research is behind paywalls, how much did it cost to make some of it open, and how well do we utilise our repositories. And so in this session, we've got Jess Howie, who's the Open Research Manager for Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato, which is the University of Waikato. She leads the Aotearoa Scholarly Communication Community of Practice as well. So we have Jess, and we also have Richard White, who is the Manager of the Copyright and Open Access at Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato, the University of Otago. And they have both been working on this CONZUL project since 2019, and they'll present an update on the latest findings in this long-running project to give us the first idea of how open our work is, find out if anything has changed and where things might be headed as we head into a new phase of our journey to a more open system. Over to you, Richard and Jess.
Kia ora. Thanks, Siobhan. Ko Jess toko ingoa. I'm really pleased to be here presenting this to you today. I'm just going to share my screen. Bring my Zoom back. Okay. So we have been doing this for a while now. We presented on this last year, and at that point, I think we were really excited because we had 3 years of data at the stage, and today we're bringing to you 5 years of data. And so the reason we've managed to skip a year in the middle isn't because there's been some sort of time matrix, but because we, for the first couple of years, we looked at the 2 years prior to allow for a citation window, to allow for things to have accumulated citations. And this year we grabbed the most recent year as well, because there's obviously some things we don't have to look at. And as we'll get to later, we feel like we've sort of nailed the open access citation advantage. So before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge the team. So this happens with the hard mahi of a whole bunch of people, particularly to acknowledge Richard as well, but we also have Max, Dean, Mandy, Lyndall, Barbara, Donna and Bruce, who I've got all of their names at the end, but just to acknowledge that this is very much a team effort. So Richard and I will take you through what we know, but actually we'd really like for this to be a discussion, and we've left lots of time for discussion at the end. So please hold discussion-y questions to the end, but that said, if there are points of clarification, please do call us on them during the presentation, and we can address them as they come up. So if we miss one, Siobhan, I know you'll be keeping an eye on the chat, please do let us know if there's something we need to make a point on. So Siobhan talked about the fact that this fired up in 2019 as a project sponsored by CONZUL, the Council of New Zealand University Librarians, and also to acknowledge Kim Tyrie's leadership, who's our sponsor and supports us really beautifully. But it was quite a different project in 2019, and we were working really hard to get the attention of funders, university administrators, and we had big plans. That didn't exactly go the way we wanted them in those first couple of years, but I have to say, in the year since we presented this to you, the same group last year, so much has happened. And I'm not sure it was our work that got people's attention, but people's attention is definitely focused on open access now. So just to name a few things, we've seen CONZUL's strategic priorities for 2022 to 2025 come up. We've seen the Future is Open report by Tom Saunders, which is really amazing. There's been an open access working group established by Universities New Zealand, chaired by Bryony James at University of Waikato. We've seen the OSTP White House, absolute landmark there, read and publish deals finally come to fruition in the last year. So more has happened in the last year than in the course of this whole project. So it felt right for us to grab that 5 years of data and really do a good job of looking to see, well, what's happened, where did we get to? So just to step back a bit, what this is work based on a very large data set, which comes together as a result of a piece of software written by Bruce White, who was at Massey University and is now retired, but remains a critical friend of ours. And basically what it does is it takes digital object identifiers, DOIs, and it runs them through multiple APIs. So for each of those DOIs, it grabs little bits of data. And what we end up with is a really large spreadsheet that tells us for each row, is it open? How was it made open? Who is the corresponding author? How much is it being cited? How much might it have cost to make it open? Could we have made it open without payment? So there's incredible richness in this data, and there's so much more that that can be done with it. I think the other thing that's changed across the years, and I know Max and Dean and Mandy would back me up on this particular, is this data set gets bigger and bigger every year. The volume of output is increasing more and more, and really we've only scraped the surface on what can be done with this. Right from the start, the kaupapa behind this project was really to use this data to enable people, to make their own uses of it. So the code is open, the data is open, and we really encourage you to go and have a look and see if there's anything you might be able to do, perhaps for your own institution if you're from a university. And really make use of it, because it's a really rich resource. That said, I do have to acknowledge that this has come out of universities only, and we acknowledge that there's lots of amazing work happens outside of universities in Aotearoa. And we're only looking at things with the DOI as well. So while it is a very rich source, it's not complete. There's still a lot of things that are missing from it. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Kia ora, Jess. Tēnā koutou, ko Richard White tōku ingoa, no te whare Wānanga o tākou, ahau. So thanks for that excellent overview, Jess, and just to reiterate my thanks to the team who have worked with us on this really awesome bunch of people, really collaborative, and we're all learning stuff from each other as we go, and the leadership of CONZUL, and having set this up a few years ago, we're really seeing the fruition of the seed of that idea, I guess. So from this slide onwards, Jess and I will take turns at taking you into more of the weeds of the findings, I guess, the actual data points after Jess's overview of what this is about. So this graph here is showing you the trends across 5 years. So there's lots of color coding here, so I'll explain what these are, although I suspect most of you will have a pretty good idea what some of these are going to be for, but just so we all know what we're talking about. So over the 5 years, you can see from 2017 to 2021, the red portion is the amount of our research that is behind a paywall. So you can see it's trending down slightly. So we had 59% of our stuff in 2017 was behind a paywall, and that's reduced to 52% by 2021. So almost at the half. And I mean, some of us have looked at our individual universities. Some of us have tipped over the 50% mark, which is a nice sort of landmark to have achieved, I guess. And we're all around a similar kind of area there. But the average for the 8 universities is that it's come down to 48% open or 52% closed, depending on which way you want to look at it by the time we get to 2021. So that's the red part. Then just to make sure we know what the other colours mean, because sometimes there can be slightly different definitions applied to these. Green is repository-based OA. So all the other colours are one or other form of open, right? So green is it's in a repository. This means it may be in one of our university repositories, but it could also be in a disciplinary repository like archive, the physics archive. It could be in PubMed. It could be in any other number of disciplinary kind of repositories, as long as it's a reputable, reliable source that is trusted by Paywall is the place we get this status from. So it doesn't include ResearchGate or academia or those kinds of places. They're not repositories. They're commercial academic social networking sites effectively. So anyway, so green it's in a repository somewhere, and it was made open that way. And so we don't know when it became open exactly, at some stage after the publication of the paper probably. Then the gold band is, this is one that does have different definitions. So in the way we're using it here, there was an APC paid and it was open at the publisher. The version of record is open. And normally, we don't know if it was waived or not, or whatever the case may have been, but normally an APC is charged by that journal. So gold publishers are MDPI, Frontiers, Hindawi, PLOS, Biomed Central, all those ones, right? So every article in those publications is open and everyone attracts a fee. So then the grayish slice is hybrid. So that is where it's a subscription publication where we are paying a fee if for general access to stuff, but an individual researcher can pay for that article to be made open. So that's your hybrid ones. So those ones also incur a fee. Then we've got bronze as the next category above that, which is a slightly odd category in that when we checked to see whether the article was free to access, it was, but there was no actual licensing information. So we couldn't tell whether it's an article that's temporarily, sometimes publishers turn off their paywall to a particular topic for a period of time, or like during COVID, there certain things are made available that wouldn't otherwise have been. So that's what bronze is. It's the sort of uncertain category. It was open when we checked, but we don't know if it's going to be open again in the future. And then the little thin slice at the top of the graph is diamond. So that's your free to read and free to publish. So no APC journals that, I mean, a lot of these will be ones we host in OJS and places like that. There's those kind of journals that are devoid of APCs. Okay, so that's your categories there. So going back to looking at the trends across time, just to pick out a couple of other details other than the overall proportion of OA, you'll notice that the major change that we've identified across this period is that gold has increased reasonably significantly. So gold, remember, being the ones where there is an APC and it's all APCs in those publications. So we haven't got the numbers on these graphs, but just to give you the actual figure. So in 2017, 14% of all New Zealand university publications with a DOI were in a gold journal, but that's increased to 23% in 2021. So it's almost 1 in 4 publications by a New Zealand university is appearing in one of those types of publishing outlets. And this is interesting for us, of course, because generally speaking, our read and publish deals don't cover gold publications. Certainly we don't have them with NDPI or Frontiers, which are the big two that we're using. And it means that researchers are making individual choices and paying direct. The relationship between the author and the publisher is a direct one. There's no library involvement, usually in most of those ones. So gold has increased quite a bit. And the other stat that's quite interesting to note is that we keep an eye on is the amount of the proportion of work that was open at the point of publication. It's an interesting stat because when you think about things like impact, media releases, public interest at the point at which something comes out, and whether other scientists and other educational institutions, researchers have access to something at the time that it comes out. That's your 3 categories of gold, hybrid, and diamond put together, because those are the 3 that would be definitely open at the point of publication. Then that has increased quite a bit as well. So in 2017, those 3 categories put together totaled 22%. So less than a quarter was actually open at the point of publication, because obviously repository could be made available sometime later. But by 2021, that's increased to 34%. And again, gold seems to be the main reason, the increase in the amount of gold stuff that's coming out. Okay, Jess, did I leave anything out there that you wanted to cover? Or no?
I think
Okay,
I think you know.
Okay, so next slide. So then, now we get on to the money side of it. So the previous slide is talking about all publications, regardless of who the corresponding author was. So the corresponding author may have been someone in Australia or Canada or Mexico or wherever, right? This is this slide is showing you a subset of all our publications where we're looking at only where the author was from a New Zealand, the corresponding author was from a New Zealand university. And the reason we do that is because it's as a proxy for thinking about who is likely to have had the responsibility for ensuring an APC is paid, right? You won't be surprised, given what I've just told you on the previous slide about the number of gold going up. Hybrid went up slightly from about 4% to 7% on the previous graph. But you won't be surprised to see the graphs on this slide going up fairly sharply over the 5 years of data that we've been looking at. So looking at the one on the left-hand side, you can see it starts off in 2017 at about $1.5 million. So that's APCs across the 8 universities. That's US dollars, mind you, not New Zealand dollars. We use US because that's the most commonly sort of quoted one by journals when they're telling us what their prices are. And that's gone up by about 3 times by the time we get to 2021. So it's a fairly steep shift. So it's something like 4.67 million US dollars by the time we get to 2021 is being spent on APCs. As I kind of alluded to earlier, we don't literally know these were paid. This is an estimate based on the fact that it's a corresponding author from a New Zealand university, and that the place that article was published, that they would charge an APC under normal circumstances. So it's increased by about 3 times overall. And when we did these stats, and actually the report we've written, which we'll link to on the last slide, that's on the CONZUL website now, exchange rate has changed quite a lot. And I checked it again yesterday just to see what it is. So in 2021, that 4.6 something US million dollars was 8.2 New Zealand million dollars last year. It's just for 2021. And you can see we've also quoted on our graph there the total spend that we've estimated across the 5 years, all added up together, as 14.67 million US dollars across the 8 universities. And that figure adds up to New Zealand $26 million over. So it's not a small amount of money. It's small if you compare it to the amount we're spending on subscriptions and digital access. But it's been adding up reasonably significantly over that period of time. And to quote the numbers, for example, of articles as opposed to the price, in 2021, we'd hit 2,214 gold and hybrid publications. So, and that was 1,841 gold and 373 hybrid. So it's by far more common, as we've seen on the previous slide, for us to be going into the gold thing, and hybrid is a lot less common. One of the reasons for that is shown in the graph on the right, is that on average, hybrid prices tend to be higher. They tend to be charged by higher prestige publications who are charging a rate for that prestige to some extent. So you can see the average prices there of US 2,200-ish for gold and 3,400-ish for hybrid by the time we get to 2021. And, you know, those, the numbers of articles will vary according to your institution. Just to give you one example from my own institution, in 2021, Otago had 427 gold and 68 hybrid. And we'll all vary, but so Otago was making up around a quarter of New Zealand's gold and hybrid ones. Different reasons that size comes into it and that sort of thing, and also the disciplines we're publishing in to some extent as well, I think. Okay, I think that's all I had to say on this slide, Jess, so it's over to you, I think, for the next one.
Cool. So that brings us to, like, where are we publishing? And I think for me, this is some of the most interesting trends over time. So the first graph we've got here is talking about publishers by volume. So we're looking at all of our outputs now, not just corresponding author and where an APC is paid. This is just like all of those outputs, how many literal outputs for each one. So the key thing I think to note here is the dominance of Elsevier, which will surprise nobody, but also the monopoly of the big four, which is, again, not something that's particularly new to us. I think what's far more important, and it's reflected in the graph in the graph on the right, which is proportion of APCs paid. So important to note not APC spend, because that would be quite a different graph, but the number of APCs paid to each of those publishers. So the two things that I think are really important here is the rise of open access only publishers. So the ones that are highlighted here are MDPI and Frontiers. There will be others though that I'm sure are on similar trajectories, but just to note, like, so MDPI is here in the grey, note the increase, and Frontiers here in the green. So they are rising very, very sharply. And when we look at it across on the right-hand side here, we can see just how big a proportion of the APCs being paid that those are taking up. So just to drill into that a little bit more and to talk about these born digital publishers and what's different about them. So they're born digital, they've got no legacy in print. So it's interesting to think about how journals are still really driven a lot by the fact that they were once upon a time bound volumes, and these publishers have no such history. So, for example, in the past, a journal with a history in print might have had page limits, and even though they're kind of arbitrary page limits now, it's still the premise is that they have X number of spots for X number of articles, and people compete for those spots effectively, right? A weird way of putting it, but that's what it is in essence. Whereas these bigger ones, and I've heard some people describe them to me, well, we should be thinking about them more as platforms than publishers, because the scale is so very different. The other thing I think is really important to note is these companies have not historically had any relationship with any library because nobody has to subscribe. So again, thinking about journals and publishers with their legacy and print, they would have marketed to libraries because the libraries were the customers, whereas these ones, and we're all seeing evidence of this, market very aggressively to researchers on the sort of scale that these large platforms allow, which is why you get these quite heavy solicitation for manuscripts, heavy reliance on special editions. And so this whole thing really is predicated on scale. And what that's meant is that there's now this debate over where exactly they fall in the scale of quality. And this is something I think would be really useful to have a discussion about afterwards. Because if you track that trajectory forward, both in terms of academic values, in terms of finance, in terms of the role of the library, I really think this trend is one that we have to keep in mind as we decide what we do going forward. I'm going to pause there and see if Richard's got anything to add, because I know that was one thing we discussed a lot when we were setting up this presentation.
No, I don't have anything to add at this point, but it's a good thing for us to discuss afterwards. Hopefully people have questions about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I will say before that is The only thing I can say for certain here is that there really doesn't seem to be much consensus. And also to note that Richard and I in that discussion are not representing CONZUL or our institution. Don't take us as read, we're just really interested in the discussion. Cool. All right. And so I said this last year, and I will never not say this, but as horrifying as those figures are, it's actually within our power to change this without the financial burden of paying. So, I mean, it's amazing how often we still need to remind people that there is a way to publish open access without paying an APC. This allows us to verify this year on year on year. So the data tells us that 75% of what was published in 2020 could be made open for free. And that's 4,500 outputs. So that's huge. So I think, like, if you think of it as a hypothetical situation, imagine if we could somehow get all of those things onto our institutional repositories via the accepted manuscript. And you say, no, that can be a barrier. That's 4,500 outputs that would, on average, we think, receive about 50% more citation. So I know this isn't all about citations, and there is much more to open access than that. But when you think about how far behind New Zealand is the rest of the world, which Richard's going to talk about shortly, that would do a huge amount for our research standings, really. So, and then if you think about that on scale to across multiple years, and the years that have gone by where this hasn't happened, the uptake of our submission to institutional repositories being so low, there's just this incredible missed opportunity. And every year we look at this data, and every year we wonder what could be, I suppose, really. I have to acknowledge here that there are barriers to green open access, to getting things on our institutional repositories. We definitely feel like we need to explore what those barriers are and what's behind them. That's been outside of the scope of this research. That said, we've speculated a lot, haven't we, Richard?
Yeah.
But it's a tempting prospect to imagine that if we could do that, if we could magic everything into our repositories, we'd get our open access portion to 80%. 80% of what we're producing being available to everyone. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. I'm going to pass back to Richard.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so Jess alluded towards the start of our talk today about citation advantage and the fact that in the first 3 years of doing this work, we'd been leaving a 2-year gap in the publications we were examining, and the main reason for that was to give that window of citations to build up at least a little bit. So, and then we changed that, so we were actually looking at 2020 and 2021 this year. So this graph is showing you the 2-year lag stuff from 2020. We won't labor this particular slide because, as Jess said, we kind of feel like the open advantage in terms of citations, which is all we can really talk about in terms of the hard data we've got here, citation averages and that sort of thing, has been pretty clearly shown. There's lots of research that has shown this. There can be differences between disciplines, and there are various other complicating factors, but all things being equal, if your thing is there for people to read, it's going to be read more, right? And therefore cited more. So this is just to kind of reiterate what we've found in previous years and showing this graph here. So going back to those categories I was talking about earlier, this was the result of the average citation counts for the different categories for 2020. When you look at all of the open types together, 72% more citations than your closed. Closed is lagging rather poorly there on 4.7. It's interesting that it comes ahead of Diamond, and we're only making inferences about why that may be. Diamond tends to be your locally run journals, as I was sort of saying earlier. They don't have the marketing arms of the big publishing houses. They don't have your spammy predatory emails going out trying to get people to publish in them, etc. So it's not really surprising to see diamond down there too, nor is it surprising to see hybrid coming out for the, some of the reasons I alluded to earlier. They tend to be higher prestige, higher impact publications that offer a hybrid option. But that said, green, if you're trying to make a case for green within your, and Donna's just added in the chat that yes, diamond journals, again, just because of the way they run, may not have DOIs and therefore wouldn't fall within our data set. So in fact, the numbers are, the number of articles in the diamond category are quite low as well. I wouldn't read too much into the diamond thing there necessarily. But yeah, so I was just talking about green there. You can see green is actually outranking gold there. So if you have people who try to suggest that repositories are a second class form of making your work available, then you can show them this graph and say, no, look, it's better than putting it in MDPI. You're going to get 0.4 of a citation more if you put it in the repository. But green and closed are the two that are really interesting to compare, because those are the same categories in that the green ones would be closed if they hadn't been put in a repository, right? So they're and we're talking about a fairly large data set, so things even out. You are talking about the same articles and the same kinds of journals spread across a large data set, and when it's in a repository, it's almost double what the closed proportion is receiving, right? So I think that's a really good stat to use potentially if you're having discussions with people about repositories. And then the last couple of things here on the slide are, I mentioned the overall 72% more citations for open, 4 times more likely to generate a media story. We haven't put that out on the graph, but that's actually in the data set as well. We've got the Altmetric API providing us with data about your number of tweets and where it's used in a policy document, and media stories. Those are the 3, I think, aren't they? As well as citations, obviously. Although the citation data we get from, this is from Crossref. Actually, yeah, this one is. Although we've also got Scopus citation data. If you can choose your citation data source in our data set as well. We've got Scopus and Crossref in there. Okay, so and 10 times more likely to be cited in policy than closed publications. I mean, if you think about who has access to expensive subscriptions, it's not policymakers, is it? So that people who work in government departments don't necessarily have access to the stuff. So again, it's not really surprising. Okay, next slide.
Oh, sorry.
You went back. Yeah. Thanks. I've got the thing open on my other screen here, and I was like, why isn't it changing? It's because I am not changing my one. You are changing the one that everyone can see. Okay, and then just mentioned towards the start, a report's been put out by the Office of the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, looking at the future for open in New Zealand, and there's quite a strong green and repository push in that. And I'm pleased to say our work that we've been doing here for CONZUL has actually had a bit of influence on that report and the discussions that led to it, and some of the discussions that have happened since. Because another thing that we can do with our data is we can identify when a paper has been funded by particular funding agencies. So 15% of all of the New Zealand authored stuff is funded by one of our top 5 funding agencies. That's, and I'll just go to my notes here. That is HRC, Marsden, Royal Society, Rutherford Fellowship, and MB. So when we take those 5 as a subset, the overall proportion of that subset of the total thing that is open is 58%. So it's quite a bit higher than the 48%. If you think back to that second slide we were looking at. So there's a correlation between being funded and your work being open. The exact reasons for that we can only sort of postulate about, but on the face of it, it's more common for research that has funding from a major funding agency to be open in New Zealand. Within that subset, gold again increased quite a bit over the 5 years. Actually, sorry, that's only 3 years we've been looking at, from 2019 to 2021. So again, those paid APC type publication venues are being favoured by researchers in this category, the same as sort of all researchers. And in terms of the volume, that's an extra 430, gone up from 433 publications to 688 in the gold category alone. So then the last thing to say about the slide is that we can also compare New Zealand funded research to research that has a New Zealand author involved in it, but has been funded by another country's funding agency. So we've got figures there for Australia, you can see 70, the US 78, and the UK 90% of funded research in the UK is open. And a large part of that is likely really policy based. We mentioned a new policy coming out of the States that will have a big impact. Won't have had an impact on these figures, but they've had a similar, slightly weaker, but a similar policy for quite a few years in the US and the UK. Very strong policy for a few years. So you can see the huge difference it makes in terms of requirements when your work is funded to have your work openly available. So Jess was saying a couple of slides ago that, yeah, we're well behind. Our rate is much lower than other countries. Next slide.
Cool, so we're coming to the end now. I guess like it leaves us to wonder kind of what does the future look like then, because with all of the changes that I outlined in the very beginning, and there will be more beyond just the ones I have mentioned, I think we're really at a fork in the road, and neither of us know what the future is going to look like. But I think this data gives us a pretty good picture of the story up till now, which can help us to move forward. It definitely feels like, I won't say end of an era, but like moving between phases in the journey. I highly encourage people to look at the recordings from the OASPA webinar that was on a conference that was on a couple of weeks ago, and they used the phrase again and again, edge of an abyss, which I think is slightly scary, but also quite accurate. So one of the things was they had a couple of people who spoke that were behind the original Budapest Open Access Initiative. And they've done like a like that's been renewed or something. I forget what the proper wording, but they've looked at it again and released a statement. And they had speakers there that were on the ground in 2001. Don't quote me on that, when they originally kind of came up with this. And they were saying that the goal for them was never to move the burden of payment from reader to publisher. They never imagined a world where APCs were a thing, which I'd never thought about what kind of world they were imagining when they came up with that. But the way it's come out is very, very different. And I think we're in a pretty unique position in New Zealand here to stop and think at this point what the right way for us to move forward is, because what we do next will dictate the sort of system that we end up with. And the other thing the Budapest Initiative emphasizes, which I think is really easy to forget when we're down in the data of stuff, is that open access is not an end in itself, but a means to other ends. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what do those ends look like for us in New Zealand, and how do we get ourselves closer to that? So before I swing to the discussion, I just again want to acknowledge the amazing team of people behind this work, and their full names are up here now on the left for the ones that worked on this year's data, but also the ones on the right who were involved from the very beginning and remain trusted allies and advisors and critical friends. And then my last slide, I promise, has links, so don't panic about copying anything down. We'll share the slides and they will have all the links. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open for discussion. Richard, I haven't been watching the chat. Is there any questions?
Rachel asked the most specific question that anyone has ever asked in the history of Zoom. So I said, no, it's fine. I thought maybe if we have time, we'll look at that one
Leave
last.
it last,
yeah, so that people the other people watching don't fall asleep while
yeah,
we're
I
answering
agree.
that one. I'm just also popping in the chat that short URL is the link to our slides. I made it. I didn't tell you this, Jess. I just slipped it in there this morning. So that will take you to the slides for people who are interested in grabbing some of the graphs and what have you. Right. Other than that, I answered a couple of brief questions on the way through, but I don't think there were any other questions, Siobhan.
No, you've answered most of them as we've gone, although maybe other people will be interested in the answer who didn't catch it. One was just around what that percentage was comparing green OA and closed in terms of receiving more citations. Delia mentioned that could be quite useful for promoting green OA, and as someone who has used those figures to do so down in Otago, it's 100% true. It is a carrot, although as said by Jess, it shouldn't be the only reason for doing it, but it does capture the imagination. And the answer to that is, Richard?
64% more. Yeah, I mean, we're not mathematicians or statisticians, but yeah, you just put green over closed and divide it, and then that's what it comes out as. So 72% was the figure when you looked at all forms of open, combined, and hybrid. Kind of bumps that average up a bit because hybrid's much more cited. But if it's just green compared to closed, then you'll get 64% more for your green than your closed.
Donna made an observation, which is a very relevant one. And that is part of the problem with diamond journals, particularly New Zealand ones, is they don't always have DOIs. And it certainly is an issue.
We're doing things at scale here. Each year we're talking about 13 or 14,000 publications coming out of New Zealand universities with DOIs. We get those from Scopus. There's no secret place to get them from. So it's all publicly available data. So yeah, it's a fairly large data set, but yeah, as Jess was saying at the start, we can't capture everything, unfortunately, and do it in this kind of programmatic way and using software to do the analysis and pulling on. So the DOI becomes effectively this kind of unique key for each row of the spreadsheet, and it means we can then go off and look up. I don't remember if we've got like 5 different APIs we're getting data from. So some pretty massive thing, and it takes overnight to run. Like if you're doing Auckland's set, which is the biggest set, the guys who run it, they just sort of set it going in the evening and let it come back to it in the morning. It takes quite a long time. Yeah,
I think I'd just like to point out too, there's some really important mahi happening in a couple of different places actually, so I won't name names, but there's a lot of discussion about I guess like amplifying diamond journals, local journals. One of the things highlighted, I think, in the Future is Open report is, what's the potential for shared infrastructure? There have been cases where some journals have been, kind of at threat of extinction, I suppose, and people have picked them up. And that's prompted lots of discussion around like, well, how do we, these journals are important publication avenues for a lot of our disciplines, a lot of our researchers. And, it's that like high tide raises all boats things, right? Like I haven't got the analogy quite right, but how do we get them all in a place where they're sort of getting the acknowledgement that they deserve? And I think that's really important, sort of thinking about the broader picture here, is it's easy to get wrapped up in like read and publish deals and stuff, but I think we need a many paths to open approach, and one that doesn't leave any particular types of publishing or discipline behind. Because there's a real question over, how do we make it open and for whom, and who is locked out of the system that we choose. So I really feel like whatever we do going forward needs to be multi-pronged.
There is a really good question from Keitha, and I apologise, Keitha, if that's not quite how you say your name, but They are asking which government agency has ownership for driving an open access policy for New Zealand and what is their current position? Very good question.
I'm not sure either of us are in a position to answer it.
No, we're really just minions doing the work of our betters. But Jess, I mean, you mentioned at the start the working group set up by UNZ, so that's kind of one thing. You know more about it than me, I think. So what can you say publicly about that? I'm not sure if a statement has been released yet, but
yeah, I'm not sure if it, I think there have been talks and things like that. So they have, I'm not sure if you can call it a government agency.
no, I mean, UNZ is not a government
but
agency.
they do have, there's talk of a nationwide statement on open access, a target, and an open access toolkit, like an advocacy toolkit. So there's national level stuff happening.
MB has made some noises about OA and some of the stuff they've released. I forget the name of it exactly, but there's a green paper on science innovation strategy, something or other. They mentioned it in that. Yeah, Keith is just saying it used to be MB. So yes, where we've had more impact, as we kind of talked a little bit about during the thing today, is actually looking at the funders. And because our data is specifically able to look at funding rates, as you know, one of the slides we were showing there, and because they have a direct funding relationship, will have more clout, I guess you'd say, in being able to say, well, we're paying for it, it should be open, if that's what they want to do. The will hasn't really been there as far as we've seen, but there are signs that's changing, that they will start matching what has happened overseas quite some years ago in some cases, where government funded and similar funding agencies will require openness as part of the funding deal, as it were. So there are some encouraging signs, but that's about all at this stage, I think.
Yeah, I think the other things worth pointing at is Tom Saunders' report, The Future is Open, and he did extensive stakeholder engagement on that. It's a fantastic document. It's well worth a full read, and it points to some of what might be happening in this direction.
So we're getting some things coming through thick and fast now. So the first one is just an observation by Tracy around the DIY, non-DIY disciplines, and law being a good example where majority have no DIYs and that they tend to choose SSRN over perhaps the repositories in their own institution. I think we could just agree with that entire statement, couldn't we?
Yeah, they sit outside our stuff. I mean, you know, something like the New Zealand Medical Journal as well has never had DIY, so they're outside our data set. Hopefully the people who have taken it over will be implementing DIYs.
Marissa made a comment, which is something actually I picked up as well, Marissa, and that is that in the past 5 years, the number of OA publications has increased by 7%, but the total APC spend in the same period has increased by 30%. So are the publishers creaming it yet again?
You could make that inference. Where our data is probably actually improving over time, and our methods, and so our data is probably more complete by the time because you know some publishers don't list their APC prices. We have to go looking for them, so there's some of that comes into it a little bit, and we're refining our methodology slightly over time. I think our 2021 figures for APCs is probably pretty accurate. Our 2017 figures probably had some gaps. That would mean that figure is actually probably higher, the amount we paid in 2017 than what we found. But yeah, so I'd be cautious about making grand statements about creaming it, but it's probably a fair inference.
I think the thing is that, like, you know, OA is increasing, APCs are increasing quite steeply, and the volume of publishing overall is increasing. So I think all those things added together.
So we have Barbara asking, do you see the shortage of time to 2030 and the global SDGs being achieved being a meaningful driver for OA and universities in particular?
Yeah, for sure. I'd be really interested in like New Zealand. Where is New Zealand on this? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I definitely feel like, you know, for example, in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, it's insane that they aren't using open access as a measure of universities' contribution to the SDGs. I see IFLA's just released something about academic libraries' contributions to the SDGs as well. I have to confess it's not my area of expertise, but I feel like there's a lot of unrealised potential here, and particularly to SDG 17, which is the kind of meta goal for all the other goals. Other people have pointed out relevance of OA to particular SDGs. I feel like it underpins them all, really, because it's about access to information and knowledge. And I think if we were to use the SDGs as a measure of how we engage with open access going forward, I'd be really interested to see what slant that put on the sort of discussions that are happening, particularly around things like read and publish deals and the work we're doing with publishers. So again, who makes it open for whom? Yeah.
And it looks like Donna and Leslie are conspiring together to make more work for you. So Donna begins by saying, two future spin-off studies. What are New Zealand's diamond journals? And in fact, I believe Jess and Richard could probably talk to that because there is something happening in that space. And the second bit, which is how do we get research into our repositories? And Leslie's like, yes, how do we get the research into our repositories? And would you like to lead an ARMS New Zealand chapter webinar next year, perhaps, on that topic?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just on the New Zealand diamond journals, we have David Nichols at University of Waikato is looking into this very thing right now. So yeah, we look forward to seeing the results of that. Philip, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thanks for all the work. My question just follows on really, and you talked earlier about speculation about the motivations and drivers for researchers going more gold than green, which is one of the two really critical things. Like you say, we're at a turning point here. The rise in these online only gold publishers is capturing money that would go elsewhere, and researchers are being marketed to and choosing that route rather than green. So I'd really be keen to hear your speculation and from everyone here and talk about how libraries can combat that.
If possible. I mean, Jess, in our slightly provocative chasm slide picture there, where you're not quite sure if the figure is going to make it over the chasm or not. We're alluding to that, what you're getting at there, Philip, which is, so, you know, we've got this 5-year picture now, and it's at that, we're at that exact point where read and publish deals will come in this year. So next year we'll be repeating this exercise and looking back at this year. And Rachel's question, actually, the long one at the start of the chat, is kind of, this is where people's minds are going to go next, right? Or already are in some cases. Now, whereas the picture we've presented today is of the past, as it were. So you're looking at research, what you've said, Philip, researcher behavior, choosing gold. But now libraries are being brought into that through read and publish deals, and having a new role within that whole kind of decision-making process that libraries haven't had before. And it's a question of who pays, you know, that, so all those gold ones have just been coming out of our research budgets, right? They've got it from somewhere. And at least some work I've done here in the past suggests, yeah, it comes out of research budgets. People who have more money are going to find the money somewhere to pay for it if that's what they really want. You know, this is the best journal in my field for this topic. I want to publish here. It costs some money. Quick, let's scrabble together some money, and they found a way to do it. I think times are changing a little bit in that respect a little bit. But anyway, I think that's a really interesting space for us to watch over the next year, certainly when we look at this next thing, but longer term as well. Jess, did you want to say something about that?
I was just going to point out discipline specificity of that too. So like we've been going around research committees for different divisions, and like the people in science were like, well, yeah, we have grants. We just pay the ABC out of the grants. We have money for that. Like, why wouldn't we? And then people in sort of the arts and education were like, what funds? Like, so yeah, but I think like the other thing is, and I kind of feel inclined, I know it might be a bit of a false dichotomy, but I kind of separate off the kind of like large scale OA publishers with just gold OA. And I think there's a clear driver towards the large scale gold OA because of that aggressive solicitation. The APCs are slightly lower. They often promise faster peer review. Like I say, there's an interesting like continuum of quality thing happening there. People are under pressure to publish lots of outputs. So they're looking to fit the right, you know, the kind of most likely thing into a slot, you know what I mean? So, I mean, I guess the executive summary of that is like incentives have a huge part to play. And at the moment, we're incentivizing publishing at scale and speed. So I think researchers will behave accordingly.
It's indicative of the kind of, certainly locally here, of the kind of approach we've had where it's just left up to people individually. There's been no coordination. I know a couple of universities have APC funds, which is an attempt to do some targeting of funds towards, you know, it being a beneficial thing for the organisation to pay for an APC for this article because it's a really good publication or whatever, or good for that person's career. But that has literally been the policy, is that it's up to individual people to decide. So we're reaping what we've sowed in the policy direction that we've taken up to this point. So there's interesting policy questions around that, I think, for our leaders to consider.
It looks like a lot of people are going to start using your slides very soon.
Yeah, it's editable as well. Yeah. So yeah, that's the whole point behind this, is that people don't have to start from scratch again. That's why we've used Canva as well. So you can and you know, by extension as well, grab your own institutional slice of the data, make your own graphs, and then, you know, it's half done for you if you can manage it. So that's the kaupapa behind this whole thing. Yeah.
So we're just coming up towards the hour, and it looks like most of the questions are tapering off. Do you want to address the question set by Rachel early on now, or?
I mean, I would actually need to open the spreadsheet and start filtering things.
That's fine. So
Richard, I'd made a time to catch up with Max on Friday because we'd already had some back and forth about the numbers, but I thought, oh, I might be able to kill two birds with one stone, but I realised it's not a simple question. I thought I'd just try, you know.
It's a good thought, and going back to what we were saying about R&P deal. So everyone, and we've done a little bit of this here, but only as a sort of a playing around with the data. That data there will tell you exactly where you published and what would have been covered by an R&P deal in 2021 if you'd had the R&P deal.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to
So you can, if you work out how to do it,
yeah,
you can literally look at exactly what would have fallen in and what wouldn't have, down to the level of, you know, individual journal, if you want to.
Yes, that's exactly what I want to do, and then sort of put a dollar amount on it, because that might be an amount of dollars we might put aside in 2023. But who knows if we take the Elsevier deal or not, and how does that change things? But sometimes just having a bit of a ballpark gives people a figure to think on, and can we fund that or not? So that was kind of weird, but let's not do it now because it's way too complex and it's 1 minute to 2.
Yep.
So I'll see you Friday, Max, and we can talk about this then.
I was just going to say that my experience in the past is that this code and the data from it can be incredibly useful, not just simply for the kind of information that's being presented or the kind of information that you need to make strategic decisions there, Rachel, but in fact at University of Otago, we even use the code to help speed up our ability to bulk upload material into our institutional repository. So it actually has quite a lot of potential, and And I'm sure that if anybody wants to know more about it and to dig into it, that Richard and Jess would be more than happy. I hope I'm not putting my spot in it, but more than happy for you to start with an email to them, just to ask, you know, some questions about the code and the data from it, and then go from there. But I will put a plug in therefore to the SCOOP group, the Scholarly Communication Community of Practice. I forgot what the SCOOP bit was, because it is actually, some of you will probably already be members, some of you may not, but I would really recommend joining if this is something you want to learn more about, because that's a really, really supportive group of people who are doing this mahi and are willing to share. Thank you, Richard, for popping in that link. Okay, so if it's okay, I just want to say thank you to Richard and Jess for today on behalf of LIANZA and the TELSIG group. It's the second time you've generously given your time and your knowledge, and you both are treasures in the library world. Thank you very much. And I love the fact that you practice what you preach, in the sense that your kaupapa is all about open. You're not only looking at research into open, you make your research available openly, and you openly share your knowledge, and that is just something that you just both need to be commended on from the community. And we will now finish with our closing karakia. Unahia, unahia. Unahia ki te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, e te ara tākata. Koia rai rongo whakairia, aki ki runga, kia teina, teina. Huye tai kie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Ka kite.